To Eye on Africa, here are your headlines on this Tuesday. ECOWAS has lifted the sanctions that it had imposed on Mali after the military coup last August. This comes after several of the bloc's demands were met. As the rainy season begins to set in across the DR Congo, our team in the country has more on how authorities and residents are trying to prevent a repeat of last year's tragic flooding. And French lawmakers are examining a bill on whether to return stolen artifacts to Benin and Senegal. The pieces include a royal throne and statues, as well as a saber that belonged to a 19th century Muslim sheikh. The Western African regional bloc ECOWAS has lifted the sanctions on Mali. It had imposed them after a military coup ousted President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta in August. Some of the bloc's demands were met, which is what led it to lift the sanctions. Nicolas Germain has the details.
It's an immense relief for the Malian people. Regional bloc ECOWAS has lifted its sanctions. It had imposed a ban on commercial trade and financial flows on the 20th of August, following the coup against President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. In the streets of Bamako, Malians welcomed the move.
Et nous remercions les différents chefs d'État d'avoir compris la souffrance des Maliens et d'avoir compris.
La sanction de la CEDEAO était contre la loi, certainement. Vraiment, c'est tout ce que moi je dis. Et je les félicite encore du fait qu'ils ont enlevé la sanction contre les Maliens. La CEDEAO a compris que la population malienne a souffert. Donc il faut tout de suite voir comment ils vont sortir de cette crise.
The sanctions were lifted because the transitional authorities met several of ECOWAS's demands. A civilian president and prime minister were designated, Bain Ndao and Mokhtar Wan. The head of the junta, Assimi Goïta, is vice president, but he has accepted that he cannot replace the president if for any reason Bain Ndao has to quit. But some of the regional bloc's requirements have not been respected yet. ECOWAS has called for the junta's dissolution and for the release of civilian and military figures arrested during the coup. The transitional government was announced on Monday. 4 members of the junta obtained key portfolios, including the defense and security ministries. Former Tuareg rebels also joined the cabinet. The leaders of the M5 movement, whose massive protests led to the fall of President Keïta, were not rewarded with important ministries.
Also in Mali, late word tonight that politician Soumaïla Cissé and French charity worker Sophie Betronin are in the process of being freed. That is according to France 24 sources. 100 suspected jihadist prisoners had been released over the weekend in what negotiating team members said was an exchange. An additional 30 prisoners were released late on Monday and flown north. Cissé served as the country's finance minister between 1993 and 2000. He was kidnapped by gunmen while campaigning last March. Betronin ran a charity for malnourished and orphaned children. She was abducted in 2016. Her son flew from Paris to Bamako on Tuesday and is now in Mali's capital waiting for his mother's arrival. Here's what he had to say.
Honestly, I'm here because I'm scared she will never arrive in Paris, so I'm making sure I'm getting closer to her. I expect she might be ill or very weak. I hope she is still drinking water. I don't think she can stand up. So I'm not getting my hopes up, but one of her companions said she was still very with it.
Un intérieur qui fonctionnait encore très bien.
3 people have been arrested in Belgium and charged with serious violations of international law linked to the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. The trio was arrested last week following police searches in Brussels and the southern Innu province. Survivors of the genocide have been demanding an acceleration in the pace of international justice. Authorities in Belgium did not say who the suspects were or what role they played in the genocide. Some 800,000 Tutsi minority citizens of Rwanda were killed by the Hutu ethnic majority over the course of 100 days in the late spring and early summer of 1994. Several countries on the continent have been hit by severe flooding in recent weeks, and to make matters worse, the DR Congo is bracing for the return of heavy rain. Last year, dozens of people died in the capital Kinshasa, and many families were left homeless. Our team in the country went to find out how authorities and residents are preparing to avoid another disaster.
This is what a typical street gutter in Kinshasa looks like. Thousands of tons of plastic waste floating in murky water. When it rains, the gutters overflow and flood the whole neighborhood.
These are plastic bottles that people have thrown into the streets. We have to clear the gutters at least once a year. We have to act quickly to prevent flooding.
With only a few days to go before the start of the rainy season, it's a race against time for authorities in Kinshasa, as well as for the city's 14 million residents. In the neighbouring district of Selembao, the biggest threat comes from erosion. Francisca Fida shows us the extent of last year's damage.
There were houses everywhere, all the way down there.
Here, the lack of proper drainage means that rainwater flows directly down these hills, carrying soil and ultimately causing landslides. Residents do what they can to avoid losing their homes.
We buy these sandbags and we pile them up, like this, to stop the water from entering our neighbour's house. We're terrified. We've already lost our neighbours. We're waiting for our turn.
For this expert, these measures won't solve the problem. He blames unregulated construction in flood-prone areas.
Our cities are poorly organized. People build houses in those areas, and yet there is no urban planning. There are no prior public works to make those areas livable.
Every year, floods cause major damage in the Congolese capital. At least 50 people died during last year's rainy season.
French lawmakers will soon vote on whether to return 26 prized artifacts to Benin and Senegal more than a century after they were stolen by French colonial forces and taken to Paris. If the bill is approved, the country will have a year to return the items. Laurent Bersacher has more.
November 2017, on his first visit to Burkina Faso, a freshly elected Emmanuel Macron vowed to look into the return of African cultural artifacts to their rightful owners.
Je ne peux pas accepter qu'une large part du patrimoine culturel de plusieurs pays africains soit en France. Il n'y a pas de justification valable, durable et inconditionnelle.
A report commissioned by Macron in 2018 found that some 90,000 African artifacts were still displayed in French museums. These include statues which were looted during the 1892 pillaging of the Abomey Palace in what is today Benin, or this 19th century saber, once wielded by Sheikh El Hajj Umar Tal, who founded a vast empire in West Africa and fought back against colonial powers. The weapon was already loaned out to Senegal last year in a symbolic gesture that was hailed by President Macky Sall.
En restituant, Monsieur le Premier ministre, le sabre de l'Hajj Umar Tal, mystique, intellectuel hors pair, saint homme et résistant, la France célèbre, en même temps que sa propre grandeur, l'honneur et la dignité d'un combattant.
France's culture minister recently said that returning stolen artifacts could open a new chapter of cultural and diplomatic ties with Africa. Those who oppose restitution, meanwhile, argue the process could be detrimental to France's global cultural standing.
Finally, there is concern in Senegal tonight after tens of thousands of Muslims gathered in the holy city of Touba for the annual Grand Magal pilgrimage. Senegal's borders are closed, and this year's event is smaller than usual, but authorities still fear it could turn into a super spreader event for COVID-19. Emerald Maxwell has the story.
As many as 3 million people have travelled to Touba in past years for the Grand Magal pilgrimage. This year, it's in the tens of thousands. But that's still the biggest gathering in Senegal since COVID-19 arrived in the country. Despite fears it will allow coronavirus a large-scale chance to spread, the Senegalese president gave his blessing for the Magal to go ahead as long as precautionary measures are followed to the letter. In contrast to previous celebrations, there's no official ceremony this year, and conferences will be streamed online. The festival is one of the most important dates on the calendar of the Sufi Muslim Murid Brotherhood, Senegal's most influential religious order.
J'ai vu qu'il y a pas mal de gens, qui ont reçu la sensibilisation, comme il a dit le Khalif, ça veut dire le port du masque obligatoire. On essaie de respecter cela. Et les mesures barrières aussi, il y a pas mal de dispositifs du genre des alcoogènes, ainsi de suite, toutes les entrées, même à l'entrée de la mosquée, on nous a donné des gels à toucher avant de rentrer. Je pense que les dispositifs sont bons.
In March, the government introduced a state of emergency and a ban on gatherings. But these were lifted in July, although the country's land borders are still closed, preventing pilgrims coming from further afield. Senegal has so far avoided the high death tolls seen elsewhere. With some 15,000 coronavirus cases, authorities have recorded 311 fatalities to date.
That wraps up this edition of Eye on Africa. Thank you very much for watching. The news continues on France 24 right after this.